Welcome to the Nutritious and Delicious podcast. I'm your host, Bethany, and I've been in the health and wellness space for over 17 years. As a previous health nurse and now certified holistic nutritional consultant, I help clients with their hormone health, fertility, and family health. Join us on this journey as we connect with experts from around the globe, sharing insights and personal stories along the way. So today I'm here with the amazing Stephen. So welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be
Yeah.
here.
So, Stephen is actually a coach, a pain and rehab strength coach dedicated to helping individuals over 30 eliminate their aches and pains, allowing them to return to the activities they love. So, Stephen is actually a new dad as well. He just had a little girl. So, I'm super excited to talk to him because our podcast topic today is all about how to safely work out during pregnancy and postpartum. So, Stephen, I would love for you to kind of come on, tell us a little bit how you got started in the industry here and a little bit about being a new dad.
For sure. Yeah. So, I was kind of my own first client or patient in a way. I was my own guinea pig. I had a terrible back injury, disc herniation, sciatica, like my whole right leg was numb at one point, and I was in a lot of pain, obviously. And this is in my early 20s, and I felt like I was about 80 years old. And, I went to every traditional place you could imagine, doctors, physios, chiros, and I just wasn't getting any better. And clearly something was missing in terms of the traditional ways that we treat pain and injury. And so I started doing my own research. I got into kinesiology and health science, got my training certification, started testing things on myself, reading a lot of research papers, and I ended up being able to fix myself. And now I'm a competitive power lifter, a runner. I can lift 500 pounds on a deadlift and my back is perfectly fine. So I haven't had pain in the longest time. And so now I try to help other people to do the same thing, not just to get out of pain, but to really get back to doing what they love, enjoy a higher quality of life, and not feel limited by pain.
Yeah, that's great that you're kind of your own test guinea pig. So that way you can kind of use that research on yourself and see if you're, and that's probably the best way to do a lot of these things is to kind of like use yourself and you're like, wow, this actually makes such a difference in my life. And I want to spread this for everybody else. Tell us a little
Well,
bit
for
about
sure.
being a new dad.
Yeah, so it's I've got an almost 7-month-old daughter now, so I'm right in the thick of things with an infant and newborn at home, and it's been incredible. It's been one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, but one of the most rewarding at the same time is
Yeah.
probably the best way to describe it. The lack of sleep is probably the toughest thing,
Yeah.
and just 24/7, you're trying to keep another human being alive, so that part is
Yeah.
tough. But just watching her change and grow and like become more aware and develop, and it seems like there's a new behavior every single day, like that is just awesome. There's nothing like it.
They teach us so much, kids. I think well, the first thing is patience, I think, because
Yeah, you
you're
kind of have
waking
to
up.
be.
Yeah, you're waking up and you're dealing obviously with someone else's needs like on a constant basis. So you really have to sort of like look at putting somebody else first and definitely, for women that's a big thing. So a lot of our listeners are women out there and myself included going through sort of pregnancy postpartum. I'd love to sort of talk to you about this because there's a lot of women that still kind of want to train and be athletic and they don't really want to lose sort of their body, but also helping them sort of gear up for that like labor delivery. And obviously you've kind of experienced that too with your wife. So, let's kind of go into some questions here talking about
Mhm.
like the workouts for women. So kind of let's talk a little bit first about understanding the relaxin hormone. Can you explain sort of the role that relaxin hormone does during pregnancy, how it affects the woman's body in terms of like flexibility and joint stability when working out?
Mhm. Yeah, so it's thankfully one of the more self-explanatory hormones, and it's in the name in itself. It's essentially part of preparation for giving birth is you
Yeah.
need to relax a lot of your joints, your ligaments, and your tendons in order to more easily give birth,
Yeah.
easier, quote unquote. And because if everything stays in its normal like homeostatic structure, like the way the joints normally are, it would be impossible to give birth to a
Yeah.
baby. So what happens specifically is when relaxin gets released, especially towards the end, 7, 8, 9 months, more of it continues to get released, and essentially all of the joints like lax essentially. So a good example of this is I was working with a client one time, and she was in all the way up until her ninth month of pregnancy.
Wow.
And I'd worked with her for like a year prior to that. So I'd seen her before and then, of course, during the process. And she always had such a hard time like squatting and squatting really low. And then all of a sudden, by like month 8 and month 9, she could like go all the way down. Like hips could open up as wide as
Yeah.
she want, knees, ankles, everything would just bend to maximum mobility. And that's part of what relaxin does, among many other hormones. So it essentially just loosens everything in a way. That's in a nutshell.
Yeah. That's great. It can almost give you like that edge, I think, of like
There
working
is a
out.
downside, though. I will say, like,
Yeah,
there's
I'm pretty sure I experienced the downside because there's also the overproduction too of it. And
mhm,
I was pretty active both of my pregnancies with my boys. And I remember it was about what you said, the 7 month mark. Soon as I sort of sat on machines where I sort of had to put my legs together and things like that, it felt for me like it was like spaghetti strands for ligaments, and I was
yeah,
almost overextend. Like I felt like I was overextending, like it didn't feel natural, if that explains it, even in like a regular motion. So I knew something had sort of shifted. I know for myself too, it was the motion of also like putting pants on, getting out the car because you're moving your leg out and things like that. And that's the pelvic
yes,
floor obviously shifting. And a lot of women experience the diastasis too, which is like the separation in the
yeah,
middle because the abdomen kind of shifts apart from each other and
mhm,
coming back. So let's talk about some safe training like practices. So what kind of specific exercises or training techniques would you sort of recommend to pregnant women to sort of maintain fitness but without like risking the injuries because of maybe the relaxin hormones? And also you've got a big belly in the way at the end too, but how can they sort of modify maybe their pregnancy progress for workouts? And maybe if you have any examples would be great.
mhm. Yeah, for sure. So going back to, the relaxin release and the joints being lax like that, again, the downside of it is, yes, we're really mobile now all of a sudden, but with that mobility can come a lack of stability at the
Yeah.
same time. So I see this a lot in people that are hypermobile, people that are maybe double jointed, they can
Oh wow.
hyperextend their elbows and knees in other places. And hey, they're more flexible than the average
Yeah.
person. But with this, if you don't have the strength and the stability in those ranges of motion that most people can't get to, that's where we have an increase in injury risk.
Right.
So the general recommendation for exercise for anyone that's pregnant is, hey, if you're already working out beforehand, you're generally safe to continue. It's not necessarily a good idea to start as you get pregnant and then go into
Yeah.
something really intense. Of course, you can still gradually expose yourself to certain things. It's never a bad idea to move, but you want to be wary of doing too much too fast. And so general recommendations would be to make sure that you're slowing down movements a little bit more, emphasizing tempo and stability. Like it's okay to go into those ranges of motion, like I mentioned with that client with the deep squat. Like it's not bad to get into that position, but you got to make sure you're stable, things are feeling good, and that you're still at least strengthening the joint and not
Yeah.
letting it feel, like you said, like a spaghetti strand or anything like that.
Right. It makes me think because I've had a couple of clients pregnant and they're like, "Oh, I'm still downhill skiing." And I'm like, "Oh, like how like it like maybe they're really good at it and like you said they're kind of used to it." So I wanted to sort of get your perspective because when I'm talking to them and they're like, "Oh, I'm on my bike and this and that," like when they're pregnant, like yes, if you're on a bike, obviously, but if you fall off or you're downhill
Yeah.
skiing and somebody goes into you by accident. So um sort of what would sort of be a recommendation if somebody is already like really active but they don't want to kind of give up their hobbies, I guess, in a sense, like
Mhm.
in terms of activities, what would you kind of tell them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my perspective on it is there's really two situations that you really want to avoid, and everything else is really fair game as far as I'm concerned. You want to avoid obviously like impact thing, like things that could obviously, whether it's falling or like falling, especially on the stomach or anything like that. You want to obviously not put yourself in those types of situations. And the other is ones where you have to generate a lot of intra abdominal pressure. Like I work with a lot of power lifters and lifters where you have to brace really hard to lift these heavy weights and things like
Right.
that. There's nothing wrong with weight training, but when you have to go to these extremes, that's where it can become dangerous, not just for yourself, but obviously for the baby too. So it's not a bad thing to still keep hobbies. But yeah, something like intense downhill skiing, I would definitely be cautious with, like, because yeah, the last thing you want is to fall forward or anything or have an impact on the stomach. So I would definitely advise against like those types of things.
Yeah.
But anything that's like non-impact, even again weightlifting done in certain ways, like with my wife going through pregnancy, like she does a little bit of running and walking and lifting herself. Like at a certain point, like she loves like barbell deadlifting and bench pressing as part of it.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, the bracing became like really uncomfortable for her with something like deadlifting, and so we left that aside and we did other sort of hip hinge based movements that still like work the area, but not with that level of intra abdominal pressure that came from it. But things like a bench press, for example, like she did all the way through pregnancy. She did it at 9 months and everything. So you can modify your activities in ways that avoid those two scenarios. And that's what I would suggest for the majority of people.
When I'm thinking of you saying bench press, I would imagine that you would have to be more inclined, because you don't want to be flat on your back either with a heavy belly,
Mhm.
because they usually say suggest
So
don't slip, lay on
yeah,
your
there's one of two
back.
things you can do with that. Like when you're flat on a bench like that and your legs are all the way on the floor, yeah, you can get a little bit of hyperextension in the low back, and with the weight of your belly, that can be uncomfortable. But an easy modification is just to put your feet up on the bench so that your knees are higher, and that tends to flatten out the lower part of the spine. Or you could do exactly what you said and be on an incline too. There's two ways you can go through it.
Right. So apart from the downhill skiing and things like that with impact, because obviously they say don't jump on
Mhm.
the trampoline either because it's the up and down motion and it can,
Yes.
dislodge the placenta and things like that.
Mhm.
With what about like avid runners? Like, what do you say to people who are like really cardio or are like high intensity? Like, what do you sort of notice with those kind of clients? Do they sort of slow down too? Because I know for me, when I was weight training, it was about that 7 month mark where I was like, I can't reach things, pull things towards me, or like it kind of became uncomfortable. So I naturally
Mhm.
sort of stopped that. But what about sort of like the avid runners out there who are impact, obviously on pavement?
Yeah, I mean the impact itself isn't the problem. It's really important just to listen to your body as that process goes along, because it's your if you're already an avid runner, your body is used to the impact. You probably have a higher average bone density than the average person, because that's the natural adaptation to that. So it's just a matter of, hey, can your hips, knees, and ankles take the amount of stress with the added weight?
Right.
Is the increase in weight in your belly and the shape, depending on how big you're showing, is that affecting your running mechanics in a way that's causing undue stress on certain areas of the body? So it's important. It's not like a blanket statement, hey, just stop running. It's like, hey, pay attention to your body. Pay attention to if there's more pain in certain areas. If you find that you're like more fatigued than usual, if your running mechanics are really changing significantly, then you might need to modify certain things, whether it's as simple as decreasing like total distance or pace, or even doing, going on a treadmill and doing a quick walk as opposed to
Right.
something with running, or even jumping on a bike as opposed to walking, depending on how comfortable it can be. Again, it depends on the person.
It makes me wonder if I don't know if you've heard these before, but like a belly band while you're pregnant,
Yes.
or while working out, because I would imagine it would sort of help hold and stabilize, like what you said, because it's sort of the hips and the weight of where the weight sits at the front as well, because it's putting a bit more strain on your back as you obviously get older. Sorry, as you get closer to the end of the pregnancy, you're kind of leaning forward more and kind of using your back sort of muscles. So I would imagine even just sort of as you're running, a belly band might help because it might sort of hold that tension a little bit more sort of central. So,
Exactly. Yeah, that's a fantastic option, because as the belly gets bigger and bigger, we have a natural curve to our spine, and the lumbar spine, the lower part of our back, naturally curves into extension. But with the weights of the belly, obviously pulls it even further into extension. And so that changes everything from the way the rest of your spine moves to the way that your pelvis sits. And that affects how your legs and knees, ankles,
yes.
like everything changes, right? So that's where, as things progress, you will have to modify things to a certain degree. You won't be able to do it exactly the way that you were
Right.
before, but something like a belly band can at the very least shift some of the stress away from just being isolated in the spine like that and dispersing it in other places, so it makes it a little more manageable.
Yeah, that's a good sort of technique, I think, for like modifying in terms of sort of that's the pregnancy part, and that's sort of leading up to like helping, obviously, like working out is really good for your cardiovascular as well. And as you know, when you go through labor, it is like a marathon. You do, you kind of have a lot of you need a lot of stamina basically. So it's kind of good to train like that because it sort of helps build up the mindset and the mentality of sort of something that is going to be a long sort of day, especially if it's your first child as well. Let's talk about more about postpartum recovery. So after giving birth, what are some key considerations for women looking to do actually better exercises? How can they effectively manage the transition while ensuring a quick recovery? Because your body's still using those hormones, right? And I think a lot of women expect that they're going to sort of go back to like their normal routine within a few months. And sometimes that's not the case.
Yeah, and honestly, that's where people get themselves into trouble the most. Like, generally speaking, like even outside of pregnancy, like we often hurt ourselves when we do too much too fast.
Yeah.
And with coming off of, giving birth, like your body goes through a lot. It's a major, major stress on the body, requires a lot of energy, and it just goes through so much. And so there's all these other factors too, like whether you got an epidural, whether, you had a C-section or a natural birth, whether you had, whether there was tearing or not. So diastasis recti, like you mentioned, there's all kinds of things that could happen during the birth that will affect how quickly you can recover. And so you have to take that into account. You have to be kind to your body. And you also have to remember that, hey, it's not just about you now. Now you've got this baby too that you're obviously looking after, and probably your sleep is going to be affected. Everything is going to be affected. So it's not just even what's physically going on with you, but a big thing that people don't often look at when it comes to pain and recovery is those outside factors, your sleep,
Yeah.
your nutrition, your overall stress, anxiety, like all of these things. Even if you're doing everything right physically, this can create a more injurious situation. So you got to be careful of that as well and keep it in mind, because obviously your life completely changes when you have a baby. So the big things you have to look out for are, yeah, what you had to go through during the birth itself, and give yourself time. Like if
Hmm.
you need like 6 8 weeks, even more than that, before you get back to a normal routine, like that's normal, that's okay. You will get
Yeah.
back to it. And I think people get too anxious, to women, because they want to like get back to their previous before pregnancy weight and all these other things. They have all these pressures to kind of get back to it, and they want to lose some of that pregnancy weight, and they end up doing too much too fast. So it's just about tempering expectations, making sure you're taking a look at every aspect of recovery, not just the physical stuff, and making sure that you're ready for what you're doing. And the best advice I can give is just be overly conservative in the beginning with whatever you're doing, see how your body reacts, and then gradually increase over time.
It's very true what you said. I was just taking some notes as you were talking, but it sounds like focusing on the recovery first, which is hard because I think in this Western society, um, a lot of women are sort of geared into get your like your pre-baby body back. You know what I mean? Like you're supposed to be this like superwoman and still have a career and have your kids and still like look amazing. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, from women and on themselves. Like I hear it all the time. So the focus is on the recovery first, like you said. There's a lot of women that can have lots of pelvic health issues, tearing, things like that. C-section, you're even longer on recovery. And a C-section is a massive surgery, like being a nurse myself previously, I've actually witnessed them being done. I never had it done myself, but still, it's a long recovery. It's a major abdominal surgery. They're going through lots of muscle tissue. And the unfortunate thing is, after a surgery like that, they're expected to go back to normal and like now take care of something else. And they're still, recovering themselves. Whereas you would never ask somebody to do that if they had regular abdominal surgery. Like, can you go and take care of this kid now? So there's a lot of pressure, I think. And even for the mom, like mentally, there's a lot of different hormones going on, and the time for workouts. So I think the big one, I think for me, when I first kind of got back into working out, was like, how am I going to find time to do like a workout? Like I had a very high needs baby. Like my first was very colicky, so I found it hard just to give my baby to somebody because he would cry the whole time. So for me, I ended up having to find a gym where there was a daycare available. The other aspect that I struggled with was, as you know, with the babies and stuff in the first couple of years, their immune systems aren't very good. So then if there's other kids sick, they get sick every single time. So this is what I was kind of facing, was that even if I wanted to go work out, I maybe called in to the daycare because he was crying. That was one thing. Or the other aspect was the getting sick. So he wasn't allowed to come back in if he had a cold, and he would usually get that quite often. So it's just trying to be lenient on yourself and finding like different things that you can do. And so what I would do sort of instead was like do like an uphill stroller walk with him in the community, especially during like the summer and fall months, spring. Obviously, here in Canada, there's a lot of snow. So I would suggest, if that's the case, then go to a mall. Like go somewhere that's like warm inside. You know, you can get a tea or coffee and just do like a faster pace walk with them. The big one I notice is weight loss. So, like you said, like women come to you like, okay, I want to get my body back. Like I feel really bad. But the problem is too, it's not just the weight. What I've noticed, it's your body is actually shifted. Like for me, I'll give you an example. Um, my weight was down even though after I had both of them. So I was back to like a normal weight because I was breastfeeding, all that stuff. So I was burning off quite a lot of calories, and I was like slowly working out again. But the thing that I noticed was that my hips were bigger. And I was like, this is really weird. I was like, I put jeans on and I couldn't actually buckle them up. And I'm like, this is really strange. Like, I'm back at my weight. So why aren't my clothes going on, you know? And it's like your body is sort of shifted, and that relaxin hormone is still there. So things haven't kind of gone back to normal, like you mentioned, because the body is prepared for birth, but it still continues doing that while usually you are breastfeeding as well. So just I would say to the ladies is that don't be so hard on yourself, because it is a lot to do after a postpartum recovery. Whether it's your first, your second, they're all very unique and different. Um, I would ask for you as well, just sort of the last thing, like proper technique and guidance. So, what are the common mistakes that you've noticed when women are working out postpartum? And how can you sort of properly change the technique and give them guidance to help prevent those injuries and promote overall wellness during this time frame that women are kind of like, I need to get my body back?
Mhm. Well, the biggest thing to note, and a lot of people stress about this with exercise in general, they're worried about doing something wrong and hurting themselves. And the good news is there's no such thing as a bad exercise. There's no such thing as even bad form per se. Like your body can adapt and do basically anything. All exercise is made up anyway. It's all very arbitrary. It's just important that you find the right starting point to do
Right.
whatever it is you're doing. So you can take a squat, for example. There's a million ways to do a squat. Everyone's going to do it a little bit differently, but modifying it to where you're at right now is what's most important. So maybe it's you have a really high seat behind you, so you're only doing a very short range squat. Maybe you're holding on to something too to take off some of the load. So
Hmm.
starting really, really small, and like I said before, overly conservative in the beginning, and just see how your body reacts. Are you overly sore? Are you recovering enough from it? And then building yourself back up from there. Because there's no, like I said, bad exercise. There's nothing bad to do per se. It's just about finding the right thing that makes sense for you at the time, and just doing things around the house with body weight, even walking up and down stairs, walking in general is really good.
Yeah.
Will can help build you up from a good foundation.
Wonderful. And being a new parent yourself and watching obviously your wife go through everything, what is kind of a piece of advice that you would tell new parents or new moms kind of going into this? What kind of things would you advise to them?
The best piece of advice I can give to not just mothers but fathers as well is just continue to take care of yourself. Like it's very easy to just be like, I'm going to completely forget about myself so I can look after this new life, right? Which
Hmm.
is obviously important, and you need to put a lot of resources towards that.
Yeah.
But if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of them as well. It's the whole thing on an airplane. It's like, hey, put your mask on first before
Hmm.
you help, even if it's your kid beside you. Because if you're, if you're at a commission, you're no use to anybody. So don't don't let yourself fall by the wayside, like especially moms, because they feel the needs like, hey, I gave birth to this human. I'm their primary caregiver. Like I need to do everything. Forget about me. Forget about eating, sleeping,
Yeah.
working out, taking care. That's a very common
Yeah.
sentiment. So create time for yourself in little ways that you can. You don't need to dedicate an hour 5 times a week in order to keep yourself healthy, like doing like 10 body weight squats in between like feedings and like you can get creative with how you go about it is my whole point. So it's all about prioritizing it yourself because you'll be a better parent when you're healthier, more present, more,
Mhm.
when you've got everything in order for yourself. So that's the best piece of advice I can give.
That's some great advice right there. I think what you're saying is basically it's not you're not being selfish looking after yourself. You need to kind of put yourself as a higher priority because again, if you're not mentally there, you know, you're kind of emotionally burnt out, like you definitely need to take care of you first. So, thank you so much for coming onto the show, Stephen. How can our listeners find you?
My pleasure. The easiest way to find me is on social media, on Instagram at Coach Strumos, or my website, strumosfitness.com.
Oh, wonderful. So we're going to put all your notes here into the podcast show notes. And stay tuned, everybody, for our next episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a show. In good health, everybody.